Welcome to the podcast. Here we are. We're talking today about, oh, this is a tough one to put in a title, isn't it?
It
This
is a
came off
bit.
the heels of a post I put up. This was the suggestion. So I'd written a post which said, actually, shall I read it? I'll do that because I think it's going to be able to summarize it better than I can at the moment. All right, here we go. It said, if food is your portal of access to solitude, escape, comfort, or pleasure, the idea of healing your relationship with it might read as a sacrifice of the things that get you through the day. So that post had a lot of comments on it whereby I went on the What Life After Diet's Instagram account and commented on it to get more engagement and said we should do a podcast episode on that. And many it had like 20 likes. So here we are. And then our community, we're streaming live in our community right now to listeners and we voted on that topic today. So that's what we're
Mhm,
talking about.
mhm.
How do you hear that statement?
What came up for me with this idea when we were thinking about it, when I was thinking about it before we started recording, was those times when I would just have this, like an empty afternoon or empty space, and I didn't know how to get through it. Like I didn't know what to do with myself. I found it so hard to have nothing to engage with that I think food became the source of having something to engage with. I've actually just recorded a video this morning about how to stop thinking about food all the time. And part of what I'm talking about is the fact that we have so much real estate in our brain that's dedicated to thinking about food that there isn't space for anything else. And what would you be thinking about instead? All that kind of usual thing. And I thought, what do I think about instead? And I think about this a lot. I'm still thinking about this. I'm thinking about how to communicate ideas. I'm thinking about client work. I almost feel like all that area of my brain, I feel like I'm going slightly off topic here, but let's go with it. All this area of my brain that used to be very dedicated to food is now dedicated to finding ways to talk about food and
Yeah.
help people with it. For me, I guess it does kind of overlap because when you're talking about the idea of recovery, meaning giving up these things, there was a replacement.
We've talked about this. Talked
I
about
know.
this in the self-esteem episode too.
Hmm.
And I don't think, okay, I agree with you 100%. This is exactly my same experience. And I guess the idea of healing a relationship with food might suggest and can for some people, and I want to talk about that in a second, that there's this like I guess it just feels like there would be an emptiness then, if you weren't. And I think that in reality, at least the way I recovered, and it sounds like potentially the way you recovered, is that there is a replacement and that it isn't actually felt as that, but it can feel like that. Like it sounds like it would be that. And so it feels like it would just be a hole. When in fact, it was more of a translation into something different, right? Like in reality. However, I do have clients who did not go forth to become a coach. I have
Yeah,
clients
you
who
don't
have
have
as
to. You
actually
don't have to.
I've had clients who have absolutely recovered. I still keep in touch with them. It's been years. There's the recovery is solid so far. And there's not been a replacement in the lens of food itself. Like it hasn't translated there. But there have been other interests and ways of coping that have sort of replaced it. But for some, it doesn't even seem quite obvious. So I don't want to say that this is true for everybody, but I can understand why it would be true for some. That it would feel like you're just sort of stepping into some abyss of nothingness. And I wouldn't, it's like, no thanks. I'd rather just, I mean, even subconsciously, just I'd rather just stay in what's familiar and what promises to give me something to hold on to in those moments of unstructured time or transitions. Even I think about it more with transitions. That was the hardest. I think I needed food to help me transition really a lot. Um, and not having that felt like almost like there was a fear that would rise in me if I didn't have.
Are there certain transitions in particular that were more difficult than others?
The ones that were quieter, it's harder for me to deal with. Like if I'm going from something obvious here to something obvious here, I can cope with that better now, like work to home life or whatever. But if it's like a Saturday afternoon and I have nothing really to do and I'm moving from like, okay, it's the morning, I'm drinking my coffee, I'm sort of doing my morning stuff. And now it's sort of coming into the late, like the time when you'd clean up the coffee and maybe take a shower but there's no impetus to do it exactly. That is hard. Like those kind of blurry transitions. That's like I should be transitioning. transitioning, or I feel like it's time to transition, but there's no real kicker to do so. That's hard. That gray area is tough. And not in food, but that it would have been with food, then it's still tough in other ways.
Well, in those transitions, you have to make the conscious decision to, okay, now I'm going to get up and do the thing. Whereas if it's one part of your routine or two, you just have to because
Yeah.
you got kids to get ready for school. Like
Yeah, right.
things
You're
need
like
to happen.
forced. Yeah.
It's like there's no self-negotiation.
Yeah. Yes. So I'm trying to think about how this, if you use food to transition, it's difficult, but it's not quite the same as comfort, pleasure, solitude, escape.
And is it using food to transition or is it using food to delay the transition?
I think it's to cope with the transition. It is delaying it, but that is the coping, right? Like it's not somehow creating the energy to push something or to delay. Yeah, it could be either way. But sometimes I think that feeling itself, right? This feeling of, and I know a lot of people will relate to that unstructured time or transition, whatever. It gives rise to a feeling of needing to escape that we need to escape from. So I think that's where escape can come in, where it's like we feel like oh, I just need to use food to escape from something that feels uncomfortable. I think it's just going another layer into like what is that thing that feels uncomfortable? We're talking about that in the moment, but it can feel like an escape. It can also feel like, using food as a more obvious escape. And it doesn't have to be such a quiet need to escape. It might be a more obvious one, like frustration with a partner or frustration with motherhood. I'm not projecting.
Talking about a friend. Yeah.
And asking for it. Or a job or whatever it might be. Like there's needs to escape, I think, that can feel more dire. And I have clients for whom I could, like I see that happening where it's like, oh, there's a lot of in life. And this is that cocoon space that is that one time a day or however many times a day that we sort of just like retreat into this place. It's quiet in there for a moment. And it's like putting all that stuff away for a minute. And that can feel like refuge.
Mm-hmm.
So if we heal a relationship with food, what would we be doing? What happens when that need comes up?
So I don't particularly relate to the idea of eating, like I say eating for pleasure. I do. But when I was eating compulsively, it was more about trying to escape from a feeling of discomfort. It was more about tension release and relief than pleasure.
Yeah.
This weekend where a friend stayed over and they left at about lunchtime on Sunday and I had about 4 hours before I was running a group. And that moment when they left, the intensity of actually, intensity is not the right word, but I felt myself kind of crash. And it was so reminiscent. And I've spoken about this briefly before on the podcast. I think the hardest transition for me was from being around people to suddenly not being around people. Even though there are times when I'm around people and I would like to not be around people. It's not because I don't want the person to go. And it's not because I want to be with the people. But then when the people go, that shift, it's a real sense of I do not have a word for that feeling. It's like a malaise. It feels almost like a sudden mini depression. And what I would do, because it was so itchy and uncomfortable, is I would eat for a few hours. And then when I finished eating, I would kind of experience that low level mood, but like all at once, more intense. So it felt like a proper feeling. It was almost this way of trying to, maybe I didn't know what the feeling was, didn't know how to, I didn't even necessarily realize that it was a feeling. I just thought I was agitated because I wanted to eat. And I actually don't think that's true. And on Sunday, I noticed I even went out for a walk and my body felt heavier. And I thought, this feels so somatic, this feeling. And it was it was vague, but I was watching it. And because I was watching it, it felt bearable. But I don't know, I find vague feelings the hardest to deal with than the ones that are just sharp and intense and calm. And you know what you're feeling and why you're feeling it.
Yeah.
Those were.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's these subtle ones.
Mm.
That is a place where I have learned if that's happening to me now, I have a new coping for that, which is I'm like, get in the body. That itch, that quiet itch is like, oh, okay, I have something to do with that now. There's something that's like wanting to move a little bit. And I don't mean go for a walk. It could be. It absolutely could be. Because my inclination is like to analyze it and to be like, what is it? What is it? Let me figure it out. It's like the figuring it out. And I can't. And I never have. I don't think I'm gonna. Maybe, but I don't think so. And it's more like just go here and move something and see what comes up then. And I find that that actually can abate it for a bit. Not that the goal is to make it go away, but it feels like it feels like it is. But it can just help translate. I think it offers more like I did that several times over the weekend being sick because I had this sort of like ugh, again, I wasn't down and out thermometer in my mouth in bed. Do people put thermometers in their mouth anymore? No. They don't, they do the swipe. I'm so dated. Um, but it was this mm, like I don't feel right. And I don't can't even figure out why exactly. I mean, I know why. I did know why, but eh. And then it was like just go in the butt, like move, like sway, move, come down below the neck. And in doing that, it helped. I don't know, it just opened a different, it opened something different for me that helped me be able to cope.
What's going on below the neck then? You say you pay attention to it. What is it you notice in those moments?
I think it's energy in one way or another. It's either energy that's like nothing or it's a lot excited energy. And I think it just depends on the situation. If it's excited energy where I'm like, oh, I'm actually like, I need to move. That's easier for me. That one feels more like, oh yes, like I can get into that and it feels very like right. How did I not see that? But if it's the this kind where it's like I don't feel anything there, then it's like I that's curious to me. And then I'm more interested in like it's so hard to explain. It's right now, so I'm sort of like moving my feet and bringing my tiptoes up, you know, and heel toe, and sort of bopping my my knees a little bit. And that's kind of like, hey, it's almost like waking up something. And as something starts to wake up, then I'm like, oh yeah, that feels better. Now I want to stretch, you know, like, and there's something about tending to that stagnation that is like opening something else up that I didn't know was closed.
Stagnation resonates. For the benefit of the listener, we're actually streaming this live into our Facebook group, and there's a comment that's come in from Julia, which for me really feels like hits the nail on the head from my experience anyway. And Julia says, a feeling of being in conflict with the current moment, not being what I'd expect it to be, hoped it be, or think it should be. And that was definitely the case on Sunday because I knew I was going to have a few hours and I thought, oh, like maybe I could make a short for YouTube and I could do a bit of this and I could do a bit of that. And I wanted to use some time in the afternoon to do a couple of creative things. And I just wasn't feeling it. And I had to recognize that. And I realized it. And when I realized it, I thought, I don't want to try to create from this energy. I knew I needed to rest. I was tired. I needed rest. And so that's what I gave myself. But there was conflict to me about that.
What did you do?
So I went for my walk that I did. And the reason why, I tell you why I went for a walk. I went for a walk because if I didn't, I wouldn't have left the flat all day. And so I recognized the benefits of that. So I did my little hour loop that I do that's by me, which I really, really enjoy. And I know it normally feels really energizing. And I could tell even when I was walking that I felt tired. And that was the time when I thought, okay, I'm really not in a place to be trying to create some content. And so when I got back, I curled up on the sofa. I made myself, I had this fresh pasta and I had a punnet of grapes and I sat on the sofa and I curled up and I watched a couple of comedy programs.
Do you know what my favorite sentence of that was, or the one I picked up on the most was when you said, I recognized I wasn't in a place to be creating content. And I
Mhm.
feel like to Julia's question, if the moment's not what you thought it should be or planned for it to be, that conflict, it's like where your system's sort of stuck or your brain is stuck on this, like this is the path I'm supposed to, this is where I'm going, this is it. And before we understand that, that's what feels like the conflict. And then coming to the clarity of no, because this happened to me recently too, being sick. And I had plans to create content today and I can't. And it was like once I recognized that I couldn't, and like it took me a couple seconds to accept it. I could feel it, you know, like my brain was still processing that as my body was like aware. I was like, oh, I can't. And then my brain was like, but what? Like, that's what we're doing. No, it's not. No. And it took a minute. But then once it got on board, even if you're talking about like we just, you know, we expect it to feel light and happy because we just socialized, our friends just left, maybe the clarity is I feel low or whatever it might be. And once your brain and your body are sort of together on that, I think that's where to me, that's the place where energy starts moving again. And then it's like, okay, I can sink into that. So there is something interesting here about that conflict itself. And I wonder if that relates to these needs for the portals, right? So the need for the portal of escape or relief or pleasure, however you would define that, that's what food serves in a moment like that, is to sort of, well, in a moment like that, I would eat. And then that would be the reason. I'd be like, now I can't do anything. Now I've overeaten, I've binged, I'm not creating content. Never mind. I mean, I didn't do it when I was creating content, but now I'm not doing what it was I was supposed to do. And that gave me the out, rather than just being able to sort of check in and say, because at the time, I think I would have pushed. I think that there was a time when I would have been like, no, you do the thing. And maybe some subconscious part of me knew that I would do that. And so it was like, well, we'll just go this route. Because when you binge, you don't do it. Then you don't hold yourself accountable. You sort of go black and white. And then all of a sudden you fold.
I want to come back to this idea of portals, but I mean, our community's on fire here because Anne asks the very question that I think I used to struggle with a lot. And now it's there, but it's not to the same degree. And Anne said, and I question, am I just being lazy? Is it just because I need to make the effort, make myself do it? There's a couple of ways that I think about this now. On Sunday, when I decided, you know what, I'm not doing anything. I'd done my walk and I laid on the sofa. I could feel my body thanking me. That one was easier. Sometimes, you know, it's kind of a bit of a gray line. Can I push myself, or do I want to just sort of rest and chill out? That one to me was much clearer. And so the question is, am I just being lazy? Even if I am, so what? So what? We think of this idea of lazy as the worst thing that we can be.
Yeah. Yes.
What I have found, though, is when I surrender to, I'm not in a conflict with myself about it. So I'm in a conflict with myself about it. I can't even rest. In the time that I'm not doing anything, I'm not resting. I'm beating up on myself. So I found that if I really surrender to rest, sometimes when it's that I don't actually need rest, that letting myself off the hook is the very thing that actually makes me feel like doing the thing.
Yep.
That's happened so many times.
Yep. Most of the clients I work with who have lazy stories are big shoulders. Big should. You know, lots of self-expectation. It breeds laziness. I gave a client recently a 2-week homework assignment. And I said that every time for the next 2 weeks that you feel like you're being lazy and that you're in that conflict state, I want you to just go with lazy. Just do that. Like that's a homework assignment. Of course, we can get on board with homework assignments because then we have permission. But that was essentially it. It was like, give yourself permission to be lazy. Let's just see how things play out for 2 weeks. And within a day, she had texted me and was like, I've cleaned out the closet. Like I've just done the things and I did this thing for my daughter. And like, you know, anyone who's listening who identifies with the lazy story, look for your should stories. If you're big on that, likely there's a relationship.
Yes. And I think it's a little bit like giving yourself permission with food. When you actually have the food guilt-free, it's much easier to listen to what you actually want. And I guess like laziness, if you give yourself permission for some laziness guilt-free, then I think it becomes a little bit more apparent what we might actually want and need.
Yeah.
You had another example?
The other example was this. I know myself, like kind of a lack of self-trust. And I know that if I lean into the lazy story, then I'm going to continue, like it's going to become a habit. And then I'm going to, like, what if it becomes a habit? And I had somebody ask me that question, like, what if it becomes a habit? This to me is like this lack of self-trust based on evidence potentially in the past that is what happens. And I can resonate with that because there were times. So when I was in my 20s, I worked at this it was a research institute for children's psychology. And I did not like that job. I thought I would love that job. In theory, it sounds like I would have loved it. I was researching psychology, like I loved it, but I didn't love it. And it was one of those jobs you get to and you're like, this is everyone knows what they want to prove before they get there. And you're just a minion carrying out what they are already going to say. So it didn't feel actually curious and it didn't feel, anyway, it was very rote. I hated that job. Anyway, and I would go there and I was just like, it was so, and I used to, anytime that I felt like remotely sick, and I don't even mean physical, like bingy, like anything, I would take any opportunity I had to call out, excessively called out. This was a big issue. And it was, oh, and you know how much I binged to call out? I really think that link was strong. But in that scenario, I was calling out not because I was lazy. I was calling out because I hated that job. And it was speaking to something greater that I was trying to move away from. Whereas this past week, I didn't write my Wednesday weekly. 2 weeks in a row, I didn't because I've been sick. And I was disappointed to not, right? So there's this difference between, am I using something as an excuse because I really actually don't want to be doing that thing, but I think I should, versus am I actually not able to do that thing? Like, and it's not a laziness factor. It's just like, I don't have capacity factor. And I think that sometimes this conflict speaks to our larger life systems that are going on. And like, if you're repeatedly being lazy around a certain subject, is there something in the subject to look at rather than, you always being lazy?
Well, with the emails, because you did still send out your Wednesday email.
I know.
I read
was
your
waiting
last
for
couple of
someone to
emails.
call me out on that.
You still sent it out and you just shared where you were at, and they were brief, and it was obviously what you had energy for. But
Right.
it actually made me think of my yoga, right? So there could be a day when I feel so crappy and I'll just get on the mat and just
Yeah.
that's pretty much it. Like, done. It felt a little
Yeah.
bit like that. And just another aside, you call out sick?
Not now. What do you mean?
No, but that's what you
Oh, that's
say.
how we
You
call it.
call out.
We call out sick. Yeah.
We call in sick. Never heard calling out sick.
No,
You call in because you're making a phone call in
no, you
to
call
whoever to
you
say,
call out sick.
no, you call in sick.
No, you
Help
call
me
out
out
sick.
here, people.
You
Like,
call
we
out sick.
call in sick, right? I think I've got more people on the British side of the water. What about the Europeans? Julia, Julia, do you call in or do you
Oh,
call out
Canada
sick?
breaks the tie. Oh no,
I
Anna
see
is in
California
California.
call
Oh,
in. I think
East Coast.
this is just a New Jersey thing.
You call
Sarah,
out
obviously
sick.
call in. Yeah.
What? I'm standing by it, folks. I'm calling out
You
sick.
call out Steph. I think you're the only person
It's East
calling
Coast then.
out.
We're an entity to ourselves, and that is okay. We say lots of things funny.
Oh, Julia, we alert that we're sick. God
It's
bless the
not a
Germans.
Stephism. It's my whole state says this.
Your defensiveness. That's really funny. Oh, we've got to call out
Gina.
Gina.
Gina, where are you from?
Where are you, Gina?
California. All right.
Oh,
Huh.
interesting.
Well, yeah, I used to be the biggest caller out sicker. And it wasn't because I was lazy. It was because I did not like that job. And because I was in a freeze place at the time too, which is a whole different part of laziness. I didn't have capacity to do much.
And that, I think, brings us nicely to the idea of food as a portal. It's a portal to getting out of work in that situation, or getting out of a situation that you don't want to be in. Probably more accurate.
Yeah. Whatever that discomfort may be. And here's the thing. Have you ever heard, I'm sure you've heard spoon theory.
Mm-hmm.
So you only have so many spoons to it's used in pain management, right? So if somebody's got fibromyalgia or MS or something, that like you kind of think about it like, I've only got 20 spoons a day, and 5 go to showering, and 6 go to this, and 2 go to this. And you sort of have to be mindful about what energy you're spending where. Well, I think that applies to anybody, right? Like, it's not just for pain or something like that. And for some people, vulnerable populations would include trauma history, someone under great amounts of stress, somebody with a chronic health condition, somebody with anxiety or depression. And really, I mean, it's just really stress related, right? Some kind of stress on the body that, my husband, Mike, he's got like 50 spoons a day. I have about 20. That's not true anymore, but it used to be. And
I bet yours is shinier though than his.
mine is so shiny. But the comparison there, so and so, I should be able to XYZ, but not if you're considering your capacity, right? And so respecting how much capacity you have. And of course, there's ways to work with capacity. So it's not saying that you are always destined to have only 20 spoons if the rest of the world functions on 50. There's ways of working with it, but respecting that. And instead of calling oneself lazy, to put it under a different lens and to say, I don't have as much to give in a day. And I have to, because I still have to do XYZ. I still have to show up for my job. I still have to take care of my kids. I still have to write this paper, whatever it might be. And that freeze response might come in because we're just depleted and we don't have any more to give. And we're asking ourselves to give as much as Joe Schmo would give, and then we're calling ourselves lazy. And that's taking away more spoons, by the way, because then when we're beating ourselves up in our head, we're using energy to do that. our capacity is even decreasing further. So having that sort of understanding of what a freeze slash lazy response might be doing, or gosh, I can't even seem to cope with anything. I can't cope. I can't cope. I need food. Food then becomes, I mean, it serves so many purposes in that place because it's going to be the way we're potentially punishing ourselves. It might be the way we're just like, I'm going to get out of it this way. It might be the way we're refueling or trying to give ourselves energy or escaping from the very thoughts about, God, I can't cope. Everything, every minute. I remember when I used to look at the clock in a day and be counting minutes of my day. It was so hard to move through an evening because every minute I was aware of it. It was just like, when can I go to bed? Or when will this stop? And now hours go by and I don't notice because there's more capacity. But when you don't have much, everything feels hard. And then food is just like it's a portal. And just respecting that, I think having some awareness of that and not beating yourself up about that and seeing it through that lens can be in and of itself capacity giving.
Well, spoon theory suggests that when you run out of spoons, that's it. It's just done. Whereas we can borrow spoons, and I think this is the problem, is that we can borrow spoons from the next day. Sorry, I think you're laughing at
I'm laughing at your reply. I'm laughing at Sarah's question, actually, which is hysterical to me. Just for the benefit of the listeners, we're live streaming, as we said, and one of our Sarah says, a different Sarah says, "Sorry, just wanted to check what the topic is today." Spoon theory.
Looks like we're going that way. But we can borrow spoons. And this is the problem because we borrow spoons from the next day. And then we're in this constant state of depletion. It made me think about alcohol. I spoke about this once before on the podcast that I realized that when I drink alcohol, I get a lot of energy from drinking alcohol.
You do?
Yeah. So I'm someone I like to go to bed at 10 p.m. But if I've had a few drinks, I'll stay up.
Yeah.
And I'll be very happy to. But then the next day, I am absolutely exhausted. I don't really get hangovers, but I'm exhausted. And then how I started thinking about it is actually by drinking, I am borrowing energy from the next day and I have to pay it back. And I think it can be a similar thing with spoons. The problem is that we can keep pushing ourselves even when we run out of spoons for the day, but we're then borrowing spoons from the future. And now we're just constantly depleted.
And then but what we're doing is we're comparing ourselves. I think I see that most often. Like, why can't I? Because they can. Comparison comes up all the time here. And I feel like there's in this area where if you've got an eating disorder, disordered eating, probably there's a co-condition of some kind. I mean, a lot of times there is with depression, anxiety, or a chronic ill. I mean, we're probably talking to a group of people who have less spoons in general. So to compare oneself to somebody who's not struggling with those things is apples and oranges.
Exactly. And fewer spoons. But
it's spoons and forks. But let's talk to the people because I feel like anyone who might see the title of this episode and be like wanting us to talk about food as like pleasurable and food as something that's rewarding and safe, like that. I want to make sure we're addressing that part because I think that is a function of food for a lot of people. And I think it's also helpful to differentiate between people who might be listening and naming that when there's coming from a restrictive place versus people coming from a binging only place. Because if you are a restrictor, food is going to be pleasurable and it's going to be the most pleasurable because your body is making that so, right? Like your biology is saying, we'd really like some food. Food's going to be extremely rewarding. And so as long as restriction is present, food's going to be pleasurable and it will be I think will be your primary access to that. And that's not an accident. That's not because you're just so dependent on food or you're a food addict. You know how when you're very hungry, food tastes better and you're like, oh my gosh, this is the best thing ever. Versus if you're not that hungry, same exact food, still you can appreciate it, but it's not as satisfying. I just want to name that. Mm-hmm. In the case of somebody who's not so much in the restriction, I don't know, does the same thing apply? Is it, you speak to that one.
Well, it's not just pleasure that we're talking about here. We're talking about using food for some kind of positive outcome is kind of how I'm thinking about what it is we're trying to talk about here. And so the question that I sometimes ask is, what is the payoff to your binging? If it's binging, like what's the payoff? And the kind of things that I hear is that it's relief from loneliness, that it's entertainment, that it's reward. That one comes up as well. It is a way to not feel your emotions. And so there's all these things that perhaps we're using food for at times, where the follow-up question might be, what are the skills, or I don't really like the word skills. I can't think of a better word at the moment. What are the skills that we need in order to be able to fulfill those things? Let's say food is a way of continuing to push feelings away. Then you've got two options. You either find something to replace food with to push feelings away, or we're exploring this idea of how do we feel safe enough to feel?
We'll get to that.
And then the second bit, I think, is just trying to process and make sense of what is our story around the feeling.
Can I offer an example that is a bit related that just happened to me this morning?
Sure.
So my daughter, my middle daughter, who I've spoken about on the podcast before, she's like the wise beyond her years one, asks for hugs regularly. She's like, Mom, I need a hug. She'll say, Mom, I need a hug. Dad, I need a hug. She just throws it out there in the middle of nowhere. She just needs them sometimes. And I look at her and I'm like, I just think that's great because she knows she needs it. And I really respect that. And I'm glad for that. It makes me feel happy that she's in touch with that and that she asks. So I've been thinking about that lately. And then this morning I was walking through my hallway right before my kids were about to get on the bus. Mike was in the living room working, and I don't know, just this moment of like, okay, transition, like they were about to leave. And I had this feeling all of a sudden of, and I don't feel this a lot, but sometimes like I need someone to like touch me. Like I need some touch. I need some touch. And I don't typically, I'll be like, I need a massage or something like that. But I recognized it as more than just that. I wanted some touch. And I said, I said to Mike and Alex, who was standing there, I said, I need a hug. I said, I think I need a hug because I did not grow up getting hugs. Like my mom doesn't hug. She's not a hugger. She's when she hugs, she tries now. And it's the most awkward thing. She's like, that like you see in the funny video on YouTube or something. And as a result, I'm also that way. I'm not a good hugger. So I didn't understand how to understand a certain feeling as I need a hug. And I think what I used to do is like be like, I need food. This is what that feeling means to me. I've translated it somewhere else. And I feel like for different emotions, maybe it's not a hug, which is connection. Maybe it's I need comfort, or I need to relax, or whatever it might be. That for some of us who haven't learned how to give ourselves something we need, that we've replaced it with food. And so when we have a certain feeling, we're like food, because that's what I would have done. And in this moment, it was real-time recognition of, oh, that feeling means you need a hug. That's what that is. To me, this is groundbreaking because I'm like, oh, what am I going to do with that? That's so exciting. Now I can ask for hugs. But what if you can't ask for hugs, first of all? Or there's not access to something. But I still think the recognition of like, what is this feeling? What do I actually need here is there's a lot to do there. Because I think what happens is automatically we've trained ourselves to use food in place of things and to start differentiating what is the actual need happening.
The need is a hug, but what's the feeling?
That's a good question. I don't know how to describe it, except there's not words for it. It's just, I just knew I needed this. I knew that, I guess the way I get to that is like, all of a sudden it occurred to me that if someone did that, I would feel better. That's all I knew it as. Like, oh, if somebody does that, I would feel better.
Is it then like an existential ache?
It happens so fast. It's a knowing. I think it comes from doing somatic work for long enough that I recognize that my body's asking for touch. And I've been playing with that more. What does my body feel like? What does this feel like versus what this doesn't feel like? For benefit of listeners, like when my hand is on my shoulder versus when it's off my shoulder, like, ooh, this feels better. How do I know that? I don't know. I just know that. Like I've been practicing knowing that, I suppose, for a long enough time. So it's this feeling of, yeah, it might start with an existential feeling and then it becomes, I just know that I need the way I know I'm hungry. I think this might be important only in that I'm not a hugger and my kids instinctively know they need hugs. So I think it's human. We need physical touch. Like touch itself, or that feeling of containment, warmth, being held in some way. Again, I find weighted blankets really, really helpful, I think, for the same reason. I think it's something to note in this work, the impact of human touch. We've really gotten away from it, I think, culturally. And I think it's important.
I'm not a fan of weighted blankets. I feel really smothered.
Yeah. And I think you might prefer your heated blanket.
Yeah.
I think it depends on your need for proprioceptive input too, because I love a good massage as well. And again, that's touch, deep touch. Others don't want that much. I mean, have you ever cupped your face and, okay,
Oh,
so cup
yes.
this,
Yes.
but with two
Yes.
hands, I just can't
Yes.
use two hands
Yeah,
because,
yeah,
of
yeah.
course, I have that, yeah.
Yeah.
That is something that sometimes in client sessions, when I'll notice somebody getting, I'll just sort of pause and ask them to do that. And it's the most, there's a lot of silence when that happens. There's a lot of like, sometimes people are like, okay, I'm doing what you're asking me. People will get into this position and like stay. It's interesting just to watch the impact of our own skin to skin contact in certain positions that feels different. It just feels, it's different than like a cognitive, I feel better.
I think this conversation kind of highlights why we talk about the things we do in the way that we do, because there is often more around this than the food. So much talk out there about how to change the way you eat is so focused on the food and what you're eating and what you should and shouldn't be doing. Whereas without looking at this other picture, because food, it just threads into everything as a portal to connection, as a portal to pleasure, as a portal to an energy boost, as a portal to escape. I mean, there are so many ways that it can become this object that we can use for this and we can use it for that. And do you think then that it is necessary to figure out other portals to these things that we need in order to heal your relationship with food?
Only insofar as it bothers you. Or, like I don't think you can. There are times where I will use the food and I don't have a problem with that. It doesn't feel excessive to me in a way that starts to bother me. It doesn't feel problematic. So I let it be, I let it serve a function. I think it is a function. It is a coping. But of course, in this area, there's a lot of people who I think it's just a matter of food is the only way I know how to meet a need. And I don't, and I'd like to explore some others. Like I need a wider variety of ways to meet a need. Natalie wrote, I have a hugger husband and I'm the one rejecting the hug. There is discomfort there because I didn't experience comfort growing up. I'll rarely ask for touch for comfort. And I just want to name that when my husband does hug me, if I ask for it, I stand like a board. I actually don't hug it back. I just stand there and I accept the hug, but I don't give one back necessarily because I'm also uncomfortable with it, but I know I need it. And I just want to name that for anybody who thinks that you have, like, I'm not suggesting you have to become a hugger if you're not. Maybe you could like just asking for it. And he understands what I'm doing. Like we have an understanding of like the way this works. And it's funny to us, but sometimes I just need it, but I'm not ready to give it.
What's the difference then between allowing it to happen to you and you giving it to someone else in terms of how that feels
It
to
would
you?
take more spoons for me to give. I feel like in that I'm just receiving something I really need, and I have somebody who's willing to give it to me, who's not going to hold me, who's not going to take it personally. Plus, maybe it's saying I need to be taken care of. Like I need something. And I feel like this is something that lots of people have an issue with. Like I feel like I'm not allowed to receive unless I give. I don't have a problem with that. I've opted out of that idea.
Yeah. Your hugs were, and Sarah's pointed this out, and I was going to mention it earlier. Sarah in the chat's pointed it out that your hugs at the London event were a topic of conversation,
I
Steph.
know.
Like you can give a good hug. And now, whenever you meet anybody who's listened to the podcast, it's gonna be like, "Wow, I've just taken one of Steph's spoons," and they're gonna feel bad about that.
No, I had the spoons to give. I remember that hug that I gave Sarah, and it was with all my heart. And it wasn't, I didn't even think about it. It was just there. And I had a lot of energy that day. I had a lot um, coming out of me. And I feel like I had a lot to give. And so it's not impossible. It's just that there are times when I need, and when I'm needing, I don't want to give.
Well, we better start wrapping this up. Do you
Okay.
wanna just summarize what we've talked about in 30 seconds, Steph?
Wow. Sometimes food is a portal to different needs that we have that we may not even be aware of. And the idea of healing your relationship with food might feel like sacrificing getting that need met. And perhaps there is an exploration of other ways of meeting that need. Perhaps there is a way of saying, I'm allowing food to meet that need. I think we talked a lot about shoulds and shouldn'ts, interestingly. This idea of shoulding ourselves, that I feel like, yeah, that came up more than I expected it to.
Mm-hmm.
Does our community think this episode was about? If you had to summarize it, how did you hear it? Gina's like, thanks so much. Bye. People are signing off in rapid succession.
Okay. Well, I think that we can let the listener take from this episode what they use to take away. Thank you, Natalie. This has been a smorgasbord of an episode. Let's go with it. And spoons. We spoke about spoons. We spoke about laziness. We're going to have to figure out how to title this one.
Anne says, a transition coming up. Interesting, astute observation as we close the episode. Note your transition energy.
All right, people. Thanks for coming. Thanks for all your thoughts and
really nice
contributions. And if anyone listening would like to join our community, there will be details in the show notes.
Really good people there.
Really good people there.
Yeah.
Okay. Love you guys. Bye.